Feminist Book Fair 2021. If you're joining us for the first time, please take a moment to look over our Safer Spaces agreement, which is available to read on our website. We'll post the link in the chat. On the website, you can also check out the book fair stalls and the full program for the weekend. As ever, the book fair is made possible by people giving their time and labor. All donations we take go directly to the speakers and organizations taking part. So if you can, please consider donating via our PayPal. We're always keen to hear feedback about how we can improve the book fair next year and make our programming and our spaces more accessible. If you have thoughts you'd like to share after the event, please drop us a line via the feedback page on the website. This event is being live streamed through YouTube, and please, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll now explain or introduce the panelists for today. We have three panelists, and the first one I would like to introduce is Jodie Beck. Jodie organizes with Abolitionist Futures, which is a group of organizers and activists in Britain and Ireland who are working together to build a world without prisons, policing and punishment. She is also co-founder of our Empty Chair, which is a grassroots project bringing together the voices of families separated by prison throughout the coronavirus pandemic. We have also with us Jamal Khan, who is a community organizing from No More Exclusions. And we have with us as well Liat Ben-Moshe, who is a scholar activist working at the intersection of disability, madness, and institutionalization or decarceration and abolition. She's the author of the book Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization and Prison Abolition, and co-editor of Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the United States and Canada. For those of you who did come along right now, Liat had a very nice introduction at the beginning to make this all more inclusive. I think I see the captions are not on place, but we'll work on that. It is important for you to know that the first hour of the event is going to be focused on the conversation between the panelists. At the end, then the attendees, you can ask questions and we will be able to answer as good as we can. As Liat tried to say at the beginning, or you said, please, between the panelists, you try to explain a little bit. Yeah, you're going to introduce yourselves a bit, and we'll have some minutes with some statements and so on. Then I think we are ready to give the word to Jamal.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamal. The speech I'm going to share is about systemic failures in our criminal justice system that enables violence amongst young people to thrive. To begin, I'd like to share a quote which says that you can't heal in the same environment that made you sick. When I hear this, it forces me to question if the environment of my community is really anything different to the environment of prison. Because if two separate places have the same conditions, it can often mean that they perpetuate the same pain. So if not being exposed to the same danger is what one needs to be able to heal and move forward, then how is the environment of prison enabling young people's progression? Aren't they exposed to the same harm that they face in their communities, such as drugs, racial discrimination, and violence? And on the other hand, when they're released back into their communities, don't they still face the same problems that they experienced before going into prison? And sometimes more than what they initially experienced. This conversation is relevant because our criminal justice system has birthed an endless cycle of violence. It denies individuals of vital support in dealing with trauma and instead makes them endure more trauma through isolation. Yet we blame individuals when they struggle to break out of violent behavior patterns. But do we ever question if they've been given adequate mental health support on how to deal with conflict, how to adopt critical thinking skills, or whether they've been given outlets to express their experiences? all of which are vital in preventing violence, but are still things that prisons do not provide. When I look back at my time in prison, I noticed how who committed suicide in prison were seen as violent individuals. But what comes to mind when I recall the fact that they took their own lives is that hurt people hurt people. Clearly, there was an overwhelming pain that caused them to commit suicide. But how often do we consider this internal hurt as being capable to influence them in hurting others? Why does it take for someone to take their own lives to be seen as vulnerable? One of my deepest regrets is losing contact with the people that I met in prison, who I formed meaningful relationships with. I became so consumed in my own life and so busy that I wasn't able to check in and see how they've been doing since being released from prison. The reason why this haunts me so much is because so many of them have been killed, stabbed, and shot after being released from prison. These were people who had a genuine will to change, but our government fails to support that desire to change with a new environment. And as I said, you can't heal in the same environment that made you sick. You can't progress if every day you are exposed to the same harm and you are in the same community. This is the impact of incarceration. It does not cure violence, but instead allows it to continue and contributes to the problem. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jamal. Yes. Now I think that either Jodie or Liat would like to speak. Yeah.
Sure, I can go. It's really nice to meet you, Jodie and Jamal. I should first say, so I'm in Chicago, Illinois, which is in the part of Turtle Island that we call the United States. And that I come from this organizing from disability and MAD movements. And, you know, this has been kind of my connection to prison abolition. Oh, I forgot to self-describe. So for people who are watching who can't see, I'm a white, kind of pink, pale person, female, pretty femmy. I'm wearing makeup and lipstick and glasses, and I have short hair. There's a Zoom background behind me that kind of like blurs the mess, which is my office, and wearing a plaid shirt. And I don't know if you can see, I'm a wheelchair user, so you might be able to see part of the chair. I have three points that I want to make, and I'll try to be brief, and then we can kind of talk about it some more. One is really in connection to what Jamal was just talking about, which is that for people who don't know, prison is very disabling. If anybody has been to prison, either what we call juvenile, you know, prison for kids, basically, or prisons for adults, or any kind of sites of incarceration, they're very maddening, they're very disabling, and, you know, for various reasons, including their physical environment, lack of medical treatment, no affirming healthcare, no access to anything, sexuality, reproductive health care, and, you know, add to that the fact that, like Jamal was saying, these are really sites of violence, and sites of violence don't fix people, they make people worse. So even if you came to a prison without a disability or mental health kind of label or identification, you will likely have one once you leave. And most people do leave prisons, even in the US, which is incredibly draconian system. The second point in relation to that, so point number one was, you know, prison is disabling, if you didn't understand it from what Jamal was saying. Point number two is that all of us who do abolition, this is what the panel is about, really need to understand disability and madness from a not pathological way. And what I mean by this is that first, we need to understand the criminalization is only one. It's to incarceration and surveillance, and definitely medicalization is a different pathway. And I think Jamal kind of alluded to that, you know, there's things that we call halfway homes, psychiatric hospital, treatment units, habilitation, all of this stuff. But for a lot of people in my communities, which are disabled, mad, and so on, neurodivergent, they experience them as sites of incarceration. So that's really important to say that medicalization is also a pathway to surveillance and to punishment and to incarceration. The third thing I want to say is that if we talk about incarceration and decarceration without talking about disability, it really avoids understanding disability as a lived experience, as a way to view the world, and also a category of analysis. And what I mean by this is that what happens when we do that, and when we only look at disability as a deficit, as something that needs to be fixed, is that then we end up with things like mental health jails or things like that, things that are very pathological and medicalizing and basically other forms of incarceration. So in order to kind of get out of that cycle, I think it's really important for disability and MAD and neurodivergent activists to understand prison abolition and be a part of the struggle for abolishing all sites of incarceration. And it's really important for people in prison abolition movement to have a non-deficit understanding of disability and madness. And I'll just end by saying that in my work, the way that I bring that forward is to talk about deinstitutionalization, for example, the closure of psychiatric hospitals and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, or in the UK, I think it's called learning disabilities. So, the closure of these mega sites of incarceration that has happened in the 20th century in the US and Canada, I see it as kind of a knowledge, part of the history of struggle and resistance of people with disabilities that ended up in abolishing sites of incarceration. And I'm trying to kind of facilitate learning, from that history, because it's really important. Even those of us on the call that identify as disabled or MAD might not understand ourselves as politicized, as disabled or MAD, might not understand how we're connected to that history and to larger movements of resistance that have always been here, and some of them have been abolitionary. So that's my points.
Thank you, Liat. And I think it's very interesting that you are once again lifting the idea that we have to be very conscious about the disability. How is it represented in the incarceration right now, and institutionalization? I think that most people just forget it, actually, but we know that it's high rates in most countries of disabled people who are being in prison, right? And of course, institutionalized, which is related, as you said. Thank you, because I hope that we are going to get back to that intersection soon. And I wonder if Jodie would love to explain something.
Hi everyone, I'm Jodie. I'm zooming in from Watford, which is just outside of London. And for people who can't see me, I am a pale-faced white woman with my blonde hair wrapped up in a bun, and I'm wearing a black Adidas t-shirt, and I have a brick wall behind me, which gives me imposter syndrome. I do not deserve such a fantastic wall in my home, but there we go. So I am, so I'm just going to speak a little bit about abolitionist futures and our empty chair, and also just to give a little bit of context with kind of the particular things that we're organising against across England and Wales, predominantly England and Wales at the moment. But a lot of this, there are a lot of parallels with the situation in Scotland, the Scottish criminal justice system as well, because I'm aware that we're speaking at an Edinburgh Book Fair, so I'll make sure to be inclusive. And so, yeah, so Abolitionist Futures are, it's a collaboration of community organisers and activists in Britain and Ireland. And we all work together to build a future without prisons, policing and punishment. And the way in which we do that is we share information and resources to strengthen the network of existing and emerging abolitionist groups around Britain and Ireland. And so what we really try to do is to kind of help people on their journey to learning about abolition, and we do that through organising reading groups for members of the public to join and have conversations, safe conversations about abolition, and to learn together about kind of building abolition, and to kind of work through some of those trickier questions about kind of how we build a world without violence, without relying on these really harmful carceral systems. But we also, like I mentioned, bring together existing abolitionist groups to kind of share ideas, share campaigns, and to just join the dots across the different systems that we're resisting. Liat, I really appreciated what you were saying about medicalisation as a really important pathway to incarceration that can often be neglected in the sort of mainstream conversations around prisons and policing. And so what we seek to do at Abolitionist Futures is exactly that, to kind of connect the dots between the different groups that are doing this work. Kind of more of my work is that I co-founded Our Empty Chair about a year ago now, which is a grassroots organisation that particularly seeks to bring together the experiences of families that are separated through the imprisonment of a loved one throughout the coronavirus pandemic and beyond. And just to give a little bit more context around that, since the onset of like the various lockdowns, since the pandemic kind of started at the beginning of 2020, this has had such a severe impact on the prison system, and the kind of biggest kind of loss for people in prison is that they haven't been able to see their loved ones, and the contact with loved ones has been limited even through resources that exist in the prison, which like phone and letter. And so I set up Our Empty Chair because I mean I come to this issue through experiencing the imprisonment of my father throughout my life. And so at the time I was supporting him with another legal case which could have resulted in an additional prison sentence. But also what we did see was that prisoners' families started to mobilise around what was happening to their loved ones in a very public way, which is something in my experience, and it'd be great to learn more from the panel on this. I haven't really seen that before, because prisoners' families often kind of organise and have organised for decades, but they often do it behind where nobody can see. So in private Facebook groups, prisoners' wives community groups, where you kind of learn about them through word of mouth. But what changed with the onset of the pandemic, because the situation became so desperate, prisoners' families began to vocalise their concerns in a very public way. And so I sought to organise with the families, who weren't necessarily abolitionist either, which I think is a really important point. Like, a lot of people aren't even on a journey to abolition, but the organising at the heart of this was abolitionist, in the sense that we weren't approaching prisoners' families with judgment, and it kind of formulated into kind of a mutual aid project around what can we do here to reduce harm within this system right now. And so that's Our Empty Chair, and I'm sure I'll speak a little bit more about that later. But just a little bit more context around the current situation in prisons in Britain and Ireland, is that, as well as the suspension of in-person prison visits, which I know has been the case in Scotland as well. We have worked with a number of families in Scotland. Solitary confinement has actually become commonplace among all prisons in the UK. So solitary confinement is something now that every person in prison is subject to, through being locked behind their cell doors for up to 23 hours a day, with limited time to shower, exercise, access support, access healthcare, contact their loved ones. And kind of this this transition to a really restrictive prison regime went against all public health evidence that stressed the importance of reducing the number of people in prison to curb the spread of coronavirus and ultimately save lives. And we know that the healthcare that is available in prison is just nowhere near what we expect to receive in the community outside of prison walls. And so kind of starting from the point of knowing that prisons are unsafe, the added layer of a pandemic meant that the situation was incredibly terrifying, not only for loved ones, for the loved ones of people in prison, but also our communities as a whole, because we were all we're all dealing with some level of change through this pandemic, but actually people in prison are the hardest hit. And alongside all of this, the UK government have chosen not to release people from prison, but to actually commit more money and investment and resources to expanding the prison estate, which includes prisons for women, prisons for children, expanding mental health provision and mental health services, and they're partnering with the police. And so actually there's so much to be resisting at the moment, and I think the work of connecting the dots between the different systems through which people are swept up into carceral systems is more important than ever. So I'll leave it there for now, but thanks again for inviting me to be on the panel, and I'm really excited to hear more from Liat and Jamal.
Thank you, Jodie. Now, though it's a little bit late because you've been talking now and chatting for 24 minutes, I must say, like Liat told us actually to do at the beginning, that I'm the host and my name is Sonia. And I'm pretty pale myself, so when you hear my voice and the strange accent, I have a red dress on me and I'm standing with a quite white wall behind me. So because, of course, the attention is for these three wonderful panelists. And going on with the conversation, I think it's interesting that the three of you have enhanced the importance of the politicization of the prison abolition topic, because as you said, a lot of people might be touched by the issue, either because they have been in jail themselves or because somebody in their families or friends have been, but that doesn't mean that they understand all these different systems that combined are working, right, to make this a lot of lives much worse. So now I have a question. And I'm wondering, we know that it seems like across geographies and nations, the situation has been being worse during the pandemic. But before we go there, what do you mean for you, or with your experiences and the organizations you're involved in, what does it mean to organize for abolition?
I'm happy to start. For me, in the most simple kind of sense, our organising for abolition means stepping into our imaginations and actually saying no to what we've been given and demanding better. And I always, when I'm kind of having conversations with people about abolition, it's always about kind of the dictionary definition of abolition is taking something away, right? But actually what we want to do and what we organise to do is to build systems. And that can be on a very small level within your community, building systems to take care of each other, which we've seen during the pandemic, building up mutual aid systems, making sure people on the street that you live on have enough food to get by if they need to shield. All of this is central to abolition, because at its core, abolition demands that we transform our relations with each other and we treat people with kindness and with love, and we try to render all of these kind of punitive ways of interacting with each other, we need to render those obsolete. And one of my dear friends and organising pals is Dr. Sarah Lamble, and they often speak about everyday abolition. And I think that's a really important concept, because actually when we're thinking about prison abolition, the abolition of policing and punishment as a whole, that feels quite heavy, you know, and we can think like, how on earth are we going to achieve this? But I think, again, it goes back to our everyday reactions with each other. And I often think about kind of, say, with my partner who I live with, if he does something to really annoy me or upset me, how am I going to respond to that? How am I going to respond to his behavior? The punitive response would be to give him the silent treatment, not speak to him for the next couple of days, and kind of make the environment really hostile and not very pleasant. But the everyday abolitionist response would be to kind of explain why that kind of interaction has caused me to feel upset, and actually actually vocalize how I would imagine that to be repaired. And so I think it goes right down to those everyday interactions we have with people. And then on a bigger scale, I find organising for abolition, it kind of falls, I suppose, with Abolitionist Futures, because a lot of the work we do is actually resource sharing and connecting with other abolitionist groups to actually come together and organise for something bigger. I think sometimes there's a lot of pressure to make your organising public, and I think a lot of the work of abolition is actually hidden work, and that's important to say. But on the level of actually how are we dismantling these systems of harm, what I like to think about in terms of evaluating whether a particular solution is helpful or not is actually whether the solution or the thing that we're working towards expands the size of the prison system or the policing system or other systems of punishment. So an example of this is, at the moment, the UK government are currently talking about piloting a number of residential women's centres for women who have, quote unquote, offended or committed a crime. And these residential women's centres apparently will enable women to remain in their communities and just go and stay in a kind of bed and breakfast women's centre instead of going to prison. But actually, on the surface, that might look like an abolitionist response, because fundamentally, that's going to be less women that are being sent to prison. However, to get a place at a residential women's centre, a woman has to go through the court system. She has to agree to what the judge has told her to do, which is go to this residential women's centre. And then actually the residential women's centre has within it all of the same systems of surveillance, systems of control that a prison would have. And so we need to be really wary of policies that are churned out by the government that might look to speak the language of abolition or speak the language of so-called reform or kind of dismantling a system, when actually they're not. They're repackaging existing systems and tying on a fancy pink bow and saying, actually, these aren't women's prisons, these are women's centres. And if we look at the history of women's centres, that's an abolitionist idea. Women have been organising in their communities for decades and decades and decades to look after each other and to campaign for change. And it's really interesting how the government, like they often do, co-opt that language to create something that is actually really punitive. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
You had some interesting thoughts about this matter. Would you like to share it with us?
So I wrote down a response to both of your questions, specifically successes of decarceration and what does it mean to be organizing around abolition. And I think, like, to start with, to just really simplify what abolition is, like, for me, like, of my experience of going through the criminal justice system, I've heard the term rehabilitation used a lot, and often it focuses on the person as the problem, and it basically emphasizes a need for them to change. But I feel like abolition is a call to just identify that sometimes people are reacting in the most natural way to their circumstances. For example, someone is in a situation of poverty, and if they're facing lots of disadvantages and they're finding it hard to get out of that position, then crime is going to be there wherever poverty is. So I think abolition, to just simplify it, is identifying what really helps. And prisons and policing, as we know, they do not help, and they do not identify the underlying reasons. And like containing someone in prison, it doesn't prevent crime in the future. So I've written something around like examples of decarceration and also my experience around my perspective on abolition, and I'd just like to share that. So my understanding of abolition and my realization of the need for it started when I was remanded and later sentenced to prison at the age of 14. At that moment, I felt like justice wasn't served, and there were so many things that the court didn't consider. And if they did, they would have implemented support, which would have been more helpful in preventing me from committing crime again. What I mean by that is that my experience of the education system and how I was insulted by my teachers for my lack of understanding, how I was excluded from school at an early age, and then coming to the realization that I can't get a job without a decent education, questioning how I could help my single mother who was raising 7 children, that experience of poverty of an entire family being homeless for weeks. None of this was considered when addressing the crime I committed in court, which was motivated by poverty. So I knew that what took place wasn't justice. I didn't know that this reimagining of a better system was abolition, but I knew that justice wasn't served. Abolition is a call to address these underlying issues and reasons of crime, to eliminate them by the divestment of all the things that contribute to their growth and fail to provide actual solutions, for example, prisons and policing. It's an investment in all the things that do work in preventing crime It's an investment in all the things that do work in preventing crime. Sorry, my bad. It's an investment in all the things that not only do work in preventing crime, but in creating a fair society, like early intervention, equal opportunities, and more therapeutic services instead of services that are punitive. Abolition can only come, as Ruth Wilson Gilmer said, not just by abolishing prisons, but by abolishing the conditions under which prisons became the solutions to problems like poverty, white supremacy, and a lack of understanding in how adverse childhood experiences impact behavior. Abolition in practice is not just destroying this fraudulent idea of a justice system that our government currently upholds, but simultaneously building a system that does work. Because it's important to remember that while we can protest outside of prisons and campaign on why we need to abolish them, we need to also remind ourselves that there are people every day who are released back into society and they don't see the same support. So I think that abolition is about building community, because we talk about the need for alternatives to incarceration all the time. So there needs to be more organizing of that alternative. No More Exclusions, who I have been supported by, is an abolitionist grassroots movement and education focusing on racial justice. It's a community of educators, therapists, youth workers, and concerned community members aiming to abolish school exclusions and creating an education system that works for all, who not only work to create change in policy, but provide holistic support for young people who have experienced the school to prison pipeline. This is what abolition looks like in practice. The idea that we are waiting for it is a choice. The effort to establish it now is also a choice that we can make. Yeah, that's my thoughts on abolition.
Thank you, Jamal. If it's okay, I'd put the No More Exclusion website in the chat. So, which I'm not affiliated with, but I read and really learned a lot from. So, encourage others to do the same. I have, it's kind of similarly to what you both mentioned around abolition, and its connection to words like rehabilitation or decarceration. reform. Obviously, abolition is different, like you all mentioned, from those processes. And one of the things that to me is really was really important to kind of understand or emphasize about abolition was that it's really kind of, it's an ethical stance, and it's about the kind of ethics that Jodie was just mentioning it, and it's about building obviously a different world, but it's really important also the process of the building, right? So this is all to say, Ruthie Gilmore often says that abolition is about building, but abolition, of course, it's also about dismantling, right? So it's about the process of decarceration. It's about bringing people home. It's about excarceration, meaning all the kind of alternatives that Jamal was just kind of mentioning that do not exist. And it's about literally like dismantling the system that we have while simultaneously building a different, not just system, but a different society, right? And this is about redistribution of resources. This is about, so people who do any kind of work in schools, poverty, housing insecurity, this is abolitionist work because it's a work that, yes, it's done outside of prisons and psych hospitals and, all these kind of like carceral sites, but it's abolitionary work in the sense that it builds this society. But the other thing I also want to say is that abolition, to me, is about a kind of collective process that we go through. So I always kind of mention this quote from an abolitionist sociologist called Thomas Mathiasson, and he said that the alternative is something that lies in the unfinished. And I think that this is really important because the work of abolition is a work that's collective and it's always ongoing. It's a work of trial and error. It's the kind of thing where Jodie was talking about, where we in community of abolitionists on the ground say, okay, they proposed a new unit. The unit is gonna help women be with their children while they're incarcerated. Is this a reform? Is this a non-reformist reform? Meaning, is it going to expand the system, or is it a reform that's about abolition? Or is it, something that we fight? And the we, of course, in that case, has to be the women who are incarcerated, or gender non-conforming people who are incarcerated, in those facilities. So the we, of course, sometimes changes, but it's really important that the process of abolition is a constant moving towards justice. The target, of course, is the same in the sense of trying to build a new society, but it's also moving, right? We can't just stay organized around a particular issue without understanding how it's connected to all of these other issues. We can't abolish without dismantling and without rebuilding, and so on. So I think that was something that it's important to say. And the last thing I would say about that is about rehabilitation, which is like, wow, if there ever was a euphemism, right? I mean, this is so ridiculous to say that this is what it was ever supposed to do. I mean, even in some of the work that I do is really historical work or genealogical work. Even the people that established prisons, rehabilitation is not what it was supposed to do. It was about repentance. It was about reformation. It's about making people into other people. I mean, that's what the boarding schools were for Native people. This is what psychiatric hospitals are. It's about making people into new people. This is why it's called the corrections industry. It's about correcting people and correcting them into particular kind of citizens, white and patriarchal and settler and able-bodied and able-minded and sanest and all of that stuff. So I think it's really, really important to completely get rid of that notion of rehabilitation, as Jamal was saying. I mean, this is incredibly, not just ridiculous thing that some people kind of invest in order to keep the system going, but also it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous and damning understanding of what these places are supposed to do.
Yes, I think the three of you have been touching some very interesting intersections, I think, when it comes to poverty and gender. What are the reasons to keep these incarceration systems going, and especially with class and poverty? I think it's this kind of intersection is also, like Liat is explaining, is actually trying to make other people that are supposed to work better in the current capitalist system. But then, yes, then we can go ahead. And since you, as I understood, Jodie, a lot of people, we think that it's really difficult to imagine or to work together for abolitionism. But anyway, the three of you have a lot of experience in the topic, and it would be nice to hear if you have any examples of successes in abolition or decarceration or deinstitutionalization, or perhaps other alternatives to transformative justice that are being currently worked on.
I'm happy to go. And so I think that one of the successes of the abolitionist movement in across the UK in the past year, I think, is, and this isn't, I guess this is more of a indirect success in terms of like dismantling systems of punishment. But I think one of the successes is just kind of the interest in abolition that has grown, I think, since the murder of George Floyd last summer. That obviously sparked a movement across the world, actually, in terms of building systems against white supremacy, resisting white supremacy, and that drills right down into policing and prisons and punishment as a whole. So I think although it's really difficult to say this, but I do think it is a really positive time in terms of like building abolition. And actually, I think the amount that we've achieved in terms of bringing people along with us has been a real success. I think some successes have included last year, in part because of abolitionist organising, the UK government did commit to releasing over 3,000 people from prison because of the coronavirus pandemic. However, there's a caveat to that, in that they created an early release system so bureaucratic that actually only 300 people were released. But other things include things such as in Wales, there's been the decriminalisation of TV licence. And so for those of you who aren't aware, TV licence is a fee you pay to essentially watch the BBC. But the sinister thing is about that is that people are legitimately imprisoned for not paying that, which is ridiculous. So Wales are really leading the way in terms of decriminalising that. So actually nobody now in Wales can be presented in front of a court for not paying their TV licence, which again, as Jamal and Liat said, like is often related to underlying causes such as poverty. And so that's a real example of kind of where we can start to chip away at the system. And actually, I think there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of the vast majority of people in prison. And I don't think violent and non-violent distinctions are helpful at all. But I think it is worth mentioning that actually the majority of people in our prison system are there for very low-level, quote unquote, offences. And actually the transition into the community would be relatively smooth. But I think actually what we really need to look at when we're thinking about demanding a better system that genuinely takes care of people is actually what do we want our communities to look like? And actually over the past 10 years, under a right-wing government, we've seen cuts after cuts after cuts to community centres, youth support centres, Sure Start centres, which don't even exist anymore, but were literally lifelines for so many young families, single parent mothers, etc., etc. We really need to look at what we want our communities to look like, which I think is often a more comfortable question to start with, rather than what do we do without prison? What do we do without prisons when there are violent people that are in there, etc.? I think it's actually, no, what do you want your community to look like? And often you're going to get very different answers from what the state perhaps expect, because the state has a view of the public as this punitive bloc that just want loads more police and loads more prisons, when that's often not the case. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
So I'm going to speak on the perspective of like my experience of being released from prison, like what I experienced afterwards, and why I think specifically building towards abolition and implementing alternatives is improving. So like during my time of being released from prison, I participated in a lot of programs that, you know, claim to provide help for people who are being released from prison and supposedly solve their situation. Often a lot of the times they focus on things like to do with employment. They always focus on one area, like your communication skills, or just one sort of thing that they provide support for. But what I've been starting to see more recently, and since leaving like my attachment to those organizations, is actually community-led initiatives where people are coming together. And like I said, through the example of No More Exclusions, understanding that they are not just people who have experience in education. They are like a community of therapists and, you know, educators, employers, and people who have really different sort of skills that are building alternatives, you know. So I think seeing examples like that, No More Exclusions, also Forefront Project are a youth-led initiative. They've been running for the past 5 to 6 years, and they provide support for young people who have experienced violence. And a lot of them have experience of the criminal justice system. So I think in terms of building things like that, like more community-led initiatives are starting to improve. I think people are realizing that they can no longer depend on the government to understand their needs, and the community are starting to cater for those needs. And I see that from a perspective of feeling so let down by government-led initiatives and organizations, and understanding that now where my support actually lies, and holistic support, which is what people need, is from the community. Yeah, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I have to say, you know, in the US as well, the COVID moment or the past, you know, year and a half has brought a lot of really kind of terrible realizations, and also a lot of hope, I think, because of the kind of racial uprising. But what I mean by racial uprising is of course, you know, uprising against white supremacy, and a lot of people that until then were not aware of the depth of the connection between carcerality and racism, especially anti-Black racism, I think got, you know, woke or whatever, and got politicized, especially very young people. And so I think that really in terms of numbers, you know, since the 70s, this has been the biggest uprising in regards to racial justice in the US, has been like last summer. So I do think that that has brought people on to kind of understanding or wanting to understand more about abolition. Defund the police, you know, has been kind of a rallying cry for people, and so on. And so I think that that gives a lot of hope, because, you know, in relation to your question, Sonia, I mean, that is really, you know, the moment that we live is not the same moment that we lived even 2 years ago. I mean, this is how kind of fast moving this has been. And at the same time, of course, in the US, for example, I would say practically nobody has been released from prisons because of COVID. I want to say practically because the US is huge, and every state has its own kind of like system. But overall, there's been a few states that kind of let out like a few people. But overall, as abolitionist activists, we came to the pandemic with kind of like, this is the moment, right? Like, if nothing else worked, surely like dying of COVID will like release people. And this is the same, as being activist also in, nursing homes, other kind of institutions. We were like, okay, nursing homes is like 40% of, in New York State, for example, beginning with the pandemic, 40% of the death and COVID infection came from nursing homes. And we were like, okay, shut them down. This is it. Like, finally, people would realize that this is not sustainable. Warehousing people in congregate facilities is not the way we need to like treat human beings. But no, that did not happen. So, I do have to also say, with all the hope, that it has been also a very devastating moment. I mean, everybody that died of COVID, of course, died needlessly and because of government inaction. But it did lead to the kind of thing Jamal was just talking about, which is people were then disillusioned from the government. They were like, what is this? And then a lot of mutual aid projects developed, and things of that nature. And I hope that the kind of, when people say we're going back to normal, I know it's like a little bit different in the UK, but I hope that the normal is no longer. I mean, the kind of going back to what there was is completely, dangerous, unsustainable. That is not the world that we are envisioning as abolitionists. And I hope that the people that got woke, in the last 18 months will kind of stay with us on this path of creating this new world or this new vision. And the last thing, that I want to say, I'm going to post in the chat a few resources because I don't want to kind of speak too much. So I posted transformharm.org, which is an amazing, amazing resource hub that Miriam Kaba created amongst a million other things she created. And you can find a lot of stuff there. And on my website, I try to include a bunch of kind of liberation projects that are more connected to the intersection of abolition and disability. So it's on my website, but the projects are not related to me. It's just, I'm just curated like a bunch of stuff. So you can just link, click on things. And lastly, I do want to say that one of the successes, historically to me has been looking at the precedent of the closure of psych facilities and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities and learning disabilities, not as something that is like perfect. And, we also can learn from the mistakes that were made. And some of it were absolutely not mistakes, right? I mean, it's a promise that was made by the government to basically defund, right? That money would go from this decrepit mental health system that was basically a network of, a network of institutions, carceral, institutions, that was, anyway, warehousing carceral institutions. And instead of that, the government would like invest funds in community mental health and in other things. And that funds, of course, and housing and in a lot of things that never happened in the US. And in fact, what did happen at exactly the same time is neoliberalism, which is something that Reagan imported from you all, or from Margaret Thatcher. And so we live with the legacy of, austerity and neoliberalism, and perfected it in the US to like extreme length. And so there's a lot of lessons to learn, which are not so much about the mistakes of the industrialization. It was the right move to close these places, and this is what people who were incarcerated in them have fought for and have taught us. But the defund part, that was like a bait and switch. And so I think for people who are talking about defund now, there's a lot of lessons to be learned about, how to do that like wisely. And how to do that also in communities, like the kind of mutual aid projects that Jamal was referring to, and Jodie was talking earlier about the families organizing and all that. This is literally what the state does. We have to kind of learn from the lessons of both the kind of successes of deinstitutionalization, because it's the biggest decarceration that ever happened in the United States and Canada. And the biggest kind of abolition success that ever happened in terms of carceral sites. And people fought, they fought hard, and they fought for all kinds of means, and they made it happen. But we can also learn from what happened afterwards.
Yes, it seems like we really need to gather and to keep on working, like the three of you have been trying to explain now. Well, I think that now it's we've been chatting for an hour, and now it's about time to open for questions and answers. Before that, I would love to thank you for your insights and your thoughts. And I would like to tell you all, those of us watching both on Zoom and on YouTube, that tomorrow, if you will feel like it, we have a workshop for letter writing to people imprisoned at 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the UK time. So if you feel like being in this time of digital support group writing letters, then join us again tomorrow. And what we are going to do is that I'm going now to open the chat for the attendees here. It would be interesting that if you have any concrete questions to any of the panelists, please write it so, because for our attendees on the live streaming on YouTube, I will be reading the questions out loud, so everybody can know what we are talking about, because not everybody can see our chat. And what I'm going to do as well is that I'm going to copy again the links that Jamal and Liat have been sharing. And I'm going to, yes, and Jodie, and all those links, we are going to post them also afterwards in the video on YouTube, in the comments, so everybody can access them also at any time. So with that said, let's say now I'm copying yours, Jodie, before we go ahead with the questions. Let's see. Okay. Well, now, yes, everybody is able now to ask questions. Yes, Bunny writes, I wanted to thank Jamal for the information. Abolition is what helps. It's so clear and brilliant. So there you go. While you people think about questions you might have, I'm going to keep on sharing the links again, if it's okay for you. I think it's been very good that the three of you have been sharing all these intersections. Liat, I think that not everybody is very aware about the disability perspective in decarceration, I think. I read often, I live in Norway myself, and I read often about, the rates of people with different disabilities being incarcerated and not having any kind of safety. And this is not an issue. And as Jodie said as well, I think the effects of incarceration as well have not been, people have been not aware of them until COVID, actually. Yes, Sean came with, thank you to all the panelists for their incredible insights, truly appreciative. And Francesca is asking, I was wondering if anyone is campaigning against SEAM or high-intensity officers are being integrated into MH teams as first responders for frequent health service users. Does anyone you have thoughts on fighting over carceral abolition? And then there's a link, stop ZIM. Does any of you have any thoughts about it? How?
I'm aware of Stop Sim. I think the campaign is excellent and so necessary. I think something that I think is really, really important to recognise, and I think it goes back to what Liat was saying right at the very beginning, is that when we think about, I think often some people say, oh, well, we can just invest in mental health support in the community, and actually that's the job done of like getting rid of the harmful impacts, the harmful effects of punishment systems, without recognizing that actually punishment is embedded in a lot of mental health care that exists. And so we really need to be aware of that. And I think Stop Sim is responding to that, essentially embedding policing within mental health care. So it's absolutely right that we need to resist that. Yeah, I'm not sure if Liat has anything more to add.
I mean, I have more to add in the kind of in the US context. So thank you for that link. I'll look more into that. But it sounds like it's a very similar struggle and campaigns to what is going on in the US, which is that first, it's like two things. One is people are advocating for, including, I don't know that they call themselves abolitionists. They're at least maybe reformers or something, prison reformers, but they're calling for more training for police. As part of like defund the police, they're saying the role of the police shouldn't be to address mental health crisis. That should be, mental health intervention teams, or get more police kind of trained into kind of psychiatric, whatever. And both of those approaches are incredibly problematic and dangerous and really deadly. I mean, if we learned nothing from the past few years, is that they're deadly. Encounters of people with mental health crisis, if you send somebody with a gun, guess what? People who are trained in using guns are going to use guns. This is what happens. We have an incredibly militarized police force in the US, and very highly armed police force in the US. And this is what they get training in, is militarization and, weapons. And so this is what happens. So a lot of disability advocates, and some of that is on my website, under resources, it really, for many, many years have shown that how ludicrous, these demands are in terms of, first of all, their outcome. It's incredibly not effective, and how punitive and deadly these demands are to train police who are weaponized to in anything is to be complicit, with that system that kills us. But the second thing that is going on here is the increasingly militarized and punishing system of mental health in general. So even if you don't send a cop, let's say you send a social worker, social workers in the US are mandatory reporters, meaning that, and a lot of people are, actually I am, as somebody who teaches in a university that's public, meaning that whatever happens, you have to report, the thing to authorities. This is what gets kids taken away from their parents. This is what, and so on and so on. So even things that we don't think of as cops end up having really adverse consequences on people's lives and are very carceral and punitive and so on. So this is another system that needs to be abolished, and I'm really glad to hear about that campaign in the UK.
Okay, then we can go ahead. Ellie is wondering, what are your thoughts on the use of community payback orders as alternatives to prison, but still a punitive measure?
I'll just add, I'm wary of taking up too much space, but this is a particular area of interest for me. I'll just add just speak for a sec. I think that community payback orders replicate a lot of the harms that we see already by the prison system, and therefore they're part of what we should be resisting. There's a lot of research, which I'll pop in the chat, about how, particularly for women, but across the board, people who are subject to community orders and therefore are surveilled, they have to meet certain conditions, they have to attend appointments, or they'll be recalled to prison. They often feel like they're having to live, to kind of perpetuate a dual personality, in that they, for example, with women, the sort of behaviours that they are told to display can often lead them to remaining in abusive relationships, for example, because a stable family home is viewed as a tick in the rehabilitation box. And so actually none of these orders actually get to the root of what people's support needs actually are, and therefore don't solve any sort of problem. And so actually I think particularly at the moment is not so much an expansion of community payback orders, but an expansion of GPS monitoring. That forms part of what we need to be resisting, because actually it's just expanding punishment beyond prison walls. So yeah.
I think simply like to just say it like in the most simple way, as Jodie said, it's still a form of punishment. Like there's lots of issues around it, but I don't feel like it should be made as, you know, as complex as it is. Like it's still a form of punishment. And I myself like have been like before prison, like before going to prison, like I was given so many orders where I had to do like community service and do lots of, to be honest, these kind of projects, they don't serve the community. It's completely meaningless things like picking up litter, you know, clearing the car park, but they don't actually serve the community and serve the needs of people in the community. And sometimes, like for example, you would have like a youth offending service. So your youth offending service is as a place where you're supposed to go to as an alternative to prison, but still run by the government, still run by the courts, people inside that's basically police. But it's not like you're going into like an open space where the community has access to, and you're being told to, you know, take litter from there or make that space better for the community. You're literally going to the garden behind the youth offending service, so it belongs to the actual government, and you're cleaning there. You know, you're taking care of what they need to, like removing, just doing gardening in there. So I think it's completely useless, and I don't think it serves the need.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Rachel wonders, how is it best to approach people who have reservations with abolition, especially with regard to violent crimes?
I can start. Direct them to all the resources. People have been written about this for a really long time. You can Google what to do with the murderers. There's like zines and pamphlets and, you know, all this stuff from like abolitionist organizers. But, you know, really it's about, I love what Miriam Kava always says, you know, when people ask her, what do we do with the rapists? You know, what do we do with the murderers? And she's like, what do we do with them now? I mean, the system we have now is completely not accountable to any kind of harm. So it's not, that question really comes from a place that, like Jodie was saying earlier, you need to kind of divert, meaning the person who's might ask you that question, you need to ask them, what makes you safe? What will make you safe? How can we move then to safety? I mean, that is really the question, exactly like Jodie was saying at the beginning about what does the community need? Because often these questions come when they're not like just antagonistic in these kind of panels, they really come from a desire for safety. But then as communities, we need to reconceptualize what safety means. You know, what does it mean for like different populations?
I think prison, as I said, like it perpetuates the cycle of crime. We have to understand that not only are people exposed to more violence in prison, but they are exposed to like many sort of like they're exposed to like drug abuse, which worsens any sort of violence. They're exposed to more isolation, and all of for people in prison who multiple institutional abuse in school, as Liat has been saying, like a lot of people have been to mental health hospitals. A lot of people before coming into prison have gone to mental health hospitals. There's multiple levels of institutional abuse. So I feel like punitive measures, any sort of punitive measure to violence, and yeah, it doesn't help at all. We get this a lot in the work that we do with More Exclusions. A lot of the times when we're trying to like get the message across of no more exclusions for any child, people bring the question up around what about with children who commit acts of sexual violence? And you know, they always do that. They always bring those kind of conversations in to detract from our message and what we stand for. And then the way I see it is like, where did that urge of sexual violence come from? What we need to be asking bigger questions around, where do children get these urges from? Because those things are like things that they, you know, we watch on TV. It's everywhere. So I feel like, and a lot of the time when we look at people who are perpetuating violence, they themselves have been victims of violence. And the same thing goes for those who have committed sexual violence. A lot of the times people in prison who perpetuate sexual violence, they have been exploited themselves in their childhood. So I think it comes to questioning why we aren't recognizing those underlying issues, and just making sure that we don't implement any sort of punitive measure and actually focus on what does help, and incarceration doesn't help any of those things.
Now comes a very interesting question. Let's see who's willing to answer. Have any of you been influenced by anarchist theory and methods of organizing?
I'm new to organizing, so like this is not something that I've been doing for like years and years. Like I'm just, yeah. So yeah, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, admittedly, I haven't read or engaged with any anarchist theory. I came to organising because I was supporting my dad in prison. So, I mean, I'm really happy to like. I would actually love some recommendations if you have any from the person that asked that question. But yeah.
I didn't come to organizing from anarchist theory. But I'm very embedded in it. I've written in anarchist anthologies. Some of it is, I try to put all my work, you know, I've been writing for like, I don't know, over 15 years. I've tried to put all my work on my website for free, except the books. Well, one of them, just write the name of it in PDF and the word PDF, and, you know, but anyway, so I think I was in 2 anarchist anthologies or something like that with other people. So as the kind of anarchist principles, we try to really model collective writing. And one of the things that we wrote about in one of those anthologies was around the notion of critiquing the notion of DIY in anarchist organizing. So DIY, of course, do it yourself. And we, as disabled organizers, were really promoting the notion of DIT, doing it together, and how interdependence is very foundational to the way that we view the world and the way that we organize, and how it can actually be a part of anarchist organizing, you know, kind of at its roots. But there are strands of anarchist thinking and organizing, some strands of like green anarchy, for example, that are very like kind of isolationist, which is very bizarre, you know, because anarchist is about really non-hierarchical, kind of promoting non-hierarchical worlds, which is very, you know, very much a part of what abolitionists are talking about. It's also non-statist, which a lot, not all, but a lot of abolitionists also support. Exactly the kind of mutual aid projects. Mutual aid, by the way, is a conversation that comes from anarchist organizing and anarchist writing from, you know, a 19th century. This is not like a kind of a new formation, but it really comes from that. What do we do without the state? And then there's all kinds of, within anarchists, you know, feminist anarchists and so on, trying to kind of understand how do we get to no state, and also what kind of governance we seek, you know, without the state. So I don't like agree with everything, but I definitely have been thinking with anarchism for a long time.
Yes. Well, thank you. And there, Jodie and Jamal have gotten a little introduction when it comes to the historical place for mutual aid. But yes, that's anarchist. But then another question. Does anyone have any more thoughts on capitalism as a driving force behind the prison industrial complex? Because Liat, you alluded to this, and the USA is perhaps in a very, in a case that it's on its own when it comes to this, the capitalist forces behind it with the private structures you have behind this prison complex. But does anyone have any more thoughts about capitalism as this driving force in the prison complex?
I'm sure some of you have heard, but most recently the government announced secure schools. So basically a secure school is kind of like a merge of a school and a prison. So supposedly these places for young people are going to be a place where they can receive therapeutic, child-focused support, and they're supposed to help people. And who these prisons are going to be run by are Oasis Restore, and they are known for creating academies that are known to be failing young people, especially people of color and people who come from communities where they are being targeted by academies. So like that's something to keep an eye out for, just to look up now. Now there's a lot of pushback on the announcement of secure schools. And yeah, it's just one example. Privatization of prison that has most recently been announced over here. And that's a part of the PCSE bill, Police Crime Sentencing and Courts bill, which hasn't been highlighted that much in comparison to all the other issues that are a part of that bill.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so thank you for mentioning. I'll look into that more. The notion of secure schools. Here we have a different formation. It's called a little bit different, but it's built by the same companies that not just build prisons, but also build militarization. And like G4, for example, is a big one. Detention centers, military shit in Palestine. I mean, just like, they're just all evil all the time. But I just want to say very briefly, if people didn't understand, and I think, Jamal and Jodie and I could probably agree on this. I mean, abolition is anti-capitalist. I don't know if that wasn't clear, but that's kind of what it is. And so I don't see how you can fight for abolition without fighting against really capitalism. And I don't just mean private prisons. I mean everything. Everything that capitalism is and brings, I'll leave it in that. People can read Ruthie Gilmore for more.
Yeah, oh my God. Yeah, absolutely read Ruthie Gilmore on this particular one. I definitely agree with that. But I think as well, I just to kind of connect a couple of the questions together, because I did see a question about kind of the roles of charities and NGOs in upholding carceral structures. And I think that really speaks to capitalism in driving a lot of these systems of punishment as well, in relation to how we have a situation now where there are, I'm sure people have seen in the media across the UK, with certain charities actually being complicit in upholding the hostile environment. So homeless charities actually reporting people on the streets who might have precarious migration status, and then those people being subsequently deported. All of this is in a drive for more funding. And I think this all comes down to that kind of rat race of let's get as much money as we can because the money is scarce and we need to provide a service, and then you're compromising on your values to get that money, to get those resources. And that's why we see situations where there are homelessness charities taking part in punishment structures, particularly where people with precarious migration status are concerned, but also in terms of just going back to the community payback thing as well. A lot of women's charities have kind of been swept under the arm of the state in a bid for more funding, and are now often facilitators of punishment. I was speaking earlier about women's centres that have really real radical histories, and many of them now, because of the impact of austerity, rely on state funding, which often has a lot of clauses in there around you have to be responsible officers, which is probation officers. You have to inform on women that aren't attending appointments and aren't kind of meeting the terms of their license. So I think all of this connects the dots between capitalism and the pervasiveness of kind of punishment structures.
Yes. And now I have to tell you, we have just 5 more minutes of questions and answers, but I see that all of you are really interested in keep on talking, and we have 24 messages, which I think will be a great record if our panelists manage to answer all of that in 5 minutes, but we'll keep on going. And I think that if there's a lot of questions we don't manage, or the panelists don't manage to answer, perhaps it could be a good idea to keep on the conversation on the YouTube comments there. And let's see if somebody's interested in continuing this. And of course, our panelists are welcome to take a look there and see if you want to answer and can answer some. But yeah, Sean had another question. The war on drugs is part of what significantly contributes to mass incarceration, particularly that of Black and brown people, which then enables exploitation and the thriving of capitalism. Yes? It's the same case, like it's, because I know this is very, I know that that's a lot of statistics and in the US context, but is it the same, for instance, in the UK?
Can you reread that question, Sonia? It's hard to go up and down.
Yes, I will read it again. The war on drugs is part of what significantly contributes to mass incarceration, particularly that of Black and brown people, which then enables exploitation and the thriving of capitalism. Perhaps it was a comment?
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
I agree.
Yes.
I think maybe there was a second part to that, Sonia.
Okay.
That said, how would a petition on the decriminalisation of drugs and advocacy of a more rehabilitative approach contribute to the fight for the abolition of prisons?
There you go. It got cut. Yes?
I think petitions are generally really positive in terms of knowing what your the strength of your supporter base. I think I would probably start by looking at what those alternatives are in your community, if there's any best practice, and actually doing the work of I guess finding out what's out there already, and if there's anything you can build on that already exists before starting a petition. Because the more specific you can be with a petition, I think the more successful it will be. but I think that's a really great shout, and it's extremely necessary. That reminds me of, I was going to recommend an abolitionist group that does work on this. Let me just mute myself and get the name of it, and then I'll pop it in the chat. That's an excellent question.
Yeah, somebody just put in the chat also that it's been, the war on drugs has been, you know, kind of like a way to decimate leftist movement. And I totally agree with that as well. You know, obviously in the US, there's a lot of analysis around this. People can read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. For people who do read that, I just want to say that she absolutely does not talk about gender or sexuality at all. And for people who don't know, you know, the book is really about Black men specifically, which is one of the immense targets of the war on drugs in the US. But for people who don't know, men is a gender, and she does not talk about that whatsoever. She also has moved since that book to a more abolitionist stance. So, you know, that book is kind of an artifact in the time that it was written. But it is a really good kind of historical analysis of what happened in the US in relation to the war on drugs. I just want to say in relation to the, you know, the petition, I don't know the exact petition that you're kind of talking about, but or what you have in mind, but I just want to say that some of our kind of best intentions for calling for alternatives ends up medicalizing, and the kind of treatment that people ask for ends up also being punitive. You know, in the same way that Jamal was talking earlier, like coerced to do like community service that's completely meaningless. People who are coerced to take psychopharmaceuticals in order to not be in the psychiatric facilities once they're decarcerated. All of these kind of things that we think are alternatives and really just end up extending the system. So I'm not saying what you're proposing is that, but I'm just saying as abolitionists, our mind should always be towards that, because that's what the state does.
If the panelists agree, is it okay to take the one last question? You're up to it?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes? Okay. I know that it's going to be, again, a lot of people who perhaps have a lot of unanswered questions, but yeah, we'll hope that we can continue this interesting conversation in other platforms. Then Helen wonders, I'm interested in mutual aid, particularly as described by Dean Spade. I'm wondering what you think of different charities and organizations and their work in this context. Do they inadvertently uphold carceral work in the UK?
I'll give a short answer because this is, oh my God, I could talk about the problematic nature of charities for weeks, but in short, yes, they are. Some charities do amazing work, but a lot of charities are complicit in upholding structures of punishment. A really key example of this is the introduction of privatised probation in the UK, also known as transforming rehabilitation. Lots of charities were actually became the probation officers essentially, and so were actually responsible in delivering punishment.
Yes, and now we're just 1 minute over time. So I think we have to close it. I really understand that a lot of people are willing to keep on talking and asking a lot of questions when we first have Jamal, Liat, and Jodie here with us. A lot of questions, but I would love to thank the three of you for being with us today, being willing of being in the book fair. And of course, you are welcome since it's such a successful topic. And then again, thank you to all of you for attending today as well, and for being willing to having such great conversations. I can see that a lot of people have a lot of experience and knowledge. So yes, again, thank you very much. Remember that you can give donations to the organizations and mutual aid groups you would love to. Also for the wonderful panelists here today. And again, thank you very much for coming. Perhaps we'll see you again tomorrow.